Hi, everybody. Nice to see some of you and know that some of you are there. I'm in the Product and Technology Center of Excellence at Insight, and am happy to chat with any of you anytime if you ever need anything. I'm actually working on advisory services for our group. So if you need something, reach out to me anytime. But I'm very excited to be here with Ryan Polk, who is an operating partner at Insight in the same COE as me, and with James Frey, who is VP of Sales Strategy and Operations at Mirantis, formerly Docker. And they're going to have a conversation about open source and what to consider if you're thinking about going down that road. We have a nice intimate group today, so I really hope that this actually becomes more of a conversation. That was our hope all along. But I'm going to let Ryan and James kick it off. And then if you guys have any questions at all, like I said, just feel free to jump in, or if you'd rather pop it in the chat, do that, and I will push that into the conversation as we go.
Yeah,
right,
I'll kick off really quickly. And I think we've got a good small group. Actually, I think I've met most of the people on the call today, which is awesome. But I will do a quick introduction on myself just for the recording and the people who are watching this later. Love the intimate roundtable. Love being able to kind of deep dive into this topic. When we talk about open source, my background is not primarily in open source, and so James is our star here. I'll be the MC. But what I will say is that in every instance of my leadership positions in the last 15 years, we have had an open source component to our portfolio, right? We've always had that as a portion of how we run our organization. Also, as an operating partner here, I've advised probably more than 20 companies in our portfolio that have open source components or have open source as their primary component to their strategy as well. Background, former chief product officer for Carbon Black, Boston area, also former head of product for Rally Software. With that, I'll hand it off to James to talk a little bit about Docker and his experience in open source.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. So just some quick background on me, because I think it's helpful as well. So I've spent the past 25 years in sales, business development, strategy, go-to-market development. Started off inside of actually what was left of Bell Labs inside of AT&T when I came out of college. So I actually have an engineering background as well. Probably for the past 15 years, I've been working predominantly inside of companies that have formulated their primary go-to-market strategies around open source. Started with Pivotal initially, which was very Cloud Foundry oriented and Spring focused. Moved on to Docker, which I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with at this point, and have rolled that kind of into the merger between Docker and Mirantis recently in the past 2 years. So just a couple of things that I think that are helpful before Ryan and I start the dialogue. Just about me on a character level. I'm a true believer in open source ideology, but I also want to caveat and say that I'm a true capitalist as well. So I view open source as part of a toolkit to really leverage as part of a well-coordinated go-to-market strategy that drives growth for an entity or an organization. So I don't want to discount the more purest level of open source perspective in the market. Today, you will be hearing from a capitalist, and I think that's important to internalize and understand in some of the things I say about open source. The other thing I also want to say too is while I was at Docker and Mirantis at Pivotal, all three of those companies have had arguably extremely successful open source communities develop around them. Docker in particular was massive. The one key element as a capitalist, so I will tell you, is I likely know a lot more about what to not do with open source to make money than I actually know what to do, how to use it to make money. So sort of my claim to fame has been Docker, Mirantis, and Pivotal were great open source communities. I would argue that looking back in the past in terms of the size and breadth of those communities, we did not do a great job as companies really taking advantage of what the community was building around that open source to make money from it. So what I would, again, just kind of recommend for all of you is make sure as you're looking at open source decisions, I encourage you to get as much perspective as possible from all the different stakeholders in the value chain before making a decision going down this path or making new strategic directions in how you want to run your existing community. So with that, Ryan, I'll throw it back to you. I just wanted to set the context.
And I think there's good good context for this discussion as well in your intro there, and that is I'm a true believer in open source as in the altruistic effort of creating software to help make the world better, right? And doing that as a collaborative effort. I think a lot of our conversation is going to be about the kind of the collision between open source and monetization. How do we actually take open source things and either embed them in our products or actually directly monetize them? And we see that in a lot of our portfolio companies, and we also see that across the community, the software world right now. So why don't we start off a little bit with kind of what do we mean by open source? And then the definition of open source / free software. How do we, how do we divide between those two things?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So I think very often you hear, okay, explain what open source is versus free software, freemium-based models. I would tell you that, open source, which I think pretty much everybody's familiar with, right? It's just the general process of contributing source code that anyone can inspect, modify, enhance, and use under the structure of an open source licensing agreement, which governs it, right? Freemium models are inherently different. They can actually include open source, but the reality is that you're actually moving to a model where you're providing free commercial source code that is actually given away to a customer base as a basic value instantiator that builds brand awareness for your company and entices the customer hopefully into some form of organic cross-sell and upsell cycle that you can monetize from, right? So generally you see freemium models, again, can incorporate open source, but very often a lot of kind of proprietary IP protection is included in those. That again is just about showing basic value to a customer that brings them into these next stage buying cycles that you can capitalize on.
Yeah, okay. And so, I mean, a good point there as well, right? You could provide free software with source code to a customer and call it a form of freemium, right? It's the difference between that and and a true open source model. Now, I think that when we talk about the differences between those two, right? Like I could give somebody a license to use my software, or even give them the source code, and maybe even a license to modify the software individually and produce their own version of it individually. But that's not necessarily open source, right? Definitely feels like a portion of the open source world is the community itself that you create when you are building a product, right? It's the ability to get leverage and the ability to actually create a community that produces a product, right?
Yeah.
When you're thinking about communities and building an open source community, first of all, it'd be great to talk about your experience building those communities, and then maybe a little bit about positive and negative aspects of building open source communities that you've seen.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit. So I think what's, just to kind of dovetail off of that last conversation that we had around defining open source versus freemium or free software, I think one of the things that is really a differentiator between a pure OS model or open source model versus free premium is it is undeniable that open source models can really help accelerate development of your core source code and the product itself, right? Whereas freemium models don't actually instantiate this community involvement of code, sourcing and Git pushes that kind of help move things forward for you. So, when we look at kind of the development of open source communities and look at the benefits, right? Accelerating development, reducing time to market potentially, and kind of decreasing development costs long terms for the stewarding company. Those are all really attractive elements. However, what I often tell people is don't underestimate how much time and investment, even from a money standpoint, it can be to actually stand these communities up and then actually kind of move them and progress them along month over month, year over year moving forward. And so some of the kind of things that are kind of interesting when you look at some of the positive and negative behaviors that should be considered in kind of creating these open source communities in general. I have three things that I typically look at. And this is just from my experience and what I've seen. The first is there's no question, as I mentioned, that the evolution and use of and the progression of code by involving a community can rapidly innovate in new and creative ways that maybe you as a company within your own confines and kind of narrow lens of focus couldn't think of. So it opens up this massive opportunity for people to kind of think about how to use and how to orient your source code in ways that, like I said, maybe aren't totally clear to you as an entity. The effect, the kind of downstream effect of that positive piece, or not the downstream effect, but some of the negative aspects of that too, is that in open source, you're really kind of giving the community control over the code itself and that evolution, right? So one of the things you'll also see is that you do lose control over that rapid innovation and sort of the direction sometimes in terms of where that code is actually being taken. And very often, not all the time, but it can get misaligned from the general go-to-market strategy of the company itself, right? And so when that happens, right, sometimes as companies try to kind of reinstantiate or a focus and kind of move the community back in line to where they want it to go, it actually can create a little bit of a backlash, and the communities can actually create some uncertainty around the intellectual property of the open source itself, right? That causes these downstream effects where enterprise customers or maybe partnerships look at it and say, well, like that's not maybe kind of the direction where I want to go, or I'm not quite sure how this community really is kind of viewing what this is, and I'm going to kind of maybe take a look at just the risk profile, you know, around the partnership with the commercial entity itself. The other thing I will tell you is that, you know, some of the more positive things about creating the open source community is like communities have to be cared for, and they have to be cared for at like a very personal level, right? So it's about the people, it's about the community, and it's about creating this amazing energy in that community of excitement, contribution, and sharing. But the one thing I will tell you too, the downside of those communities is people, particularly in large groups, can be very fickle and they can be very high maintenance, right? And so, you know, for example, we experience this a lot within Docker. There are several different kind of, I guess, points I can bring up here, but open communities can take on, you know, kind of their own perspectives on where things should go. Particularly open communities that start to involve not just independent, let's say, developers, right, but actual commercial enterprise organizations that want to have a say in the matter as well, right? So I always kind of joke with people, but it's like, what happens when you take like the Reddit crowd and then put like all the private equity firms in the same chat room inside of Reddit? Like the whole thing collapses sometimes, right? And that's a distinct risk, right? When you create energy, it brings a lot of different interests into the community, and it can just start to become very, very interesting and time-consuming to make sure you're making the right investments to keep things focused and moving and clearing out some of the political or disagreement that happen within that community. The last thing I will tell you is, and this kind of dovetails off of the last point I made too, but communities can be a really incredible extension of the culture of your company into the market. We saw that extensively with Pivotal, as well as with Docker and with Mirantis, with some of the things we're doing around Lens now. This can be really good if your culture actually aligns to your target market customers. So from our perspective, right, you know, these companies I've been involved in for the last 15 years on open source, they've been highly oriented around developer, capturing the hearts and minds of developers. And then obviously on a monetization basis, looking at Fortune, you know, 2000, Fortune 5000 companies to actually purchase like commercial packaging constructs that build off of that open source. I've seen in certain situations where communities kind of get sometimes oriented around a real hacker-like mentality. And that's really cool because that's what all the cool kids get into, right? But at the end of the day, all of a sudden, if that starts to facilitate into, let's say, a global bank, right? And they look at your company and your community and it's about hackers and like doing all this crazy stuff that doesn't take into account like the real world dynamics of command and control and optics inside of like a banking institution. There's a significant pushback by the establishment of centralized IT to say, look, like this culture and this open source project sort of needs to get a little bit more mature in terms of how they view the world and the realities that we live in, right? So those are really the three things I would say. Like I said, the evolution, the progression of code are positive, right? The energy that you pull off the community is amazing. And the extension of your culture out into the market through that community out to your buying base can be amazing, but they all come with their unique sort of downside elements too that you need to keep in mind.
Yeah, there seems to be this, you know, teeter-totter of you know, when you think of the perspective of, you know, the most successful open source projects, and they're thriving and you know, very focused communities that are highly effective. And then you have the other side of this, of the very successful open source companies there's a dynamic here and a balance that has to be struck that is difficult, right? And we see a lot of companies, out there that they'll create an open source project. It comes from the company or a couple of core people in the company. I can't count the amount of times I've met people who have created an open source project at one company, posted it as open source, gotten permission there, and then left and created another company to commercialize that product, right? At that point, they try and maintain control over the community as a portion of their overall method. The problem with that is we end up with kind of a stagnant community that doesn't give them more leverage, doesn't give them more capabilities to the product. Whereas, lots of times you'll see an open source community that is not tied commercially to something blossom and grow quickly, right? So I guess one of the questions I have here is how do you think about community ownership as a commercial entity trying to make money off of this, right? How do you balance community ownership?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will tell you the answer to this question has actually changed pretty dramatically in the last 3 years. One of the, I think, more dangerous assumptions that was made probably for the past 5 years has been, Red Hat unequivocally was the most successful open source based, model in terms of commercialization like ever so far, right? And we can make some arguments about kind of where Kubernetes is going to take the world, but just in terms of a general company take advantage of open source, RHEL and Fedora, all that stuff is pretty amazing. I think what we learned, and I learned this the hard way, I think at Docker initially. I'm not saying you always have to do this now, but in the past, you could actually kind of create open source. And as Ryan was saying, you could kind of steward it and kind of keep it under the control of the commercial entity that actually kind of birthed it, right? So, for example, at Docker, we looked and we kind of trying to replicate a Red Hat model to a certain extent that was already almost 15 years old. But it was like, cool, like we're going to create Docker open source, and then we're going to have Docker Inc. And we'll fundamentally kind of keep the commercial entity of Docker Inc. as the formal steward over the open source, community of Docker itself. And I think one of the things that we've learned in the market is most customers at this point understand the Trojan horse mentality of go-to-market models of open source, right? Because they actually have something to look back on now and say, whoa, like this open source thing from Red Hat made me get into these massive like 30, 40, $50 million ELAs that are now part of like my operating budget. And so now they're a little bit more kind of like, okay, I know what the trick is here. So I would tell you that both from a customer perspective, as well as the community perspective, I think it's really important in order to manage the communities really well without ownership. The first thing you need to do is really look at bifurcating the stewardship of the community actually away from the commercial entity of itself. And I think a proof point in this is actually like the growth of things like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation in the past like 4 or 5 years, right? I remember looking at this thing and seeing like Kubernetes inside of it like 3 years ago. And now I think I saw a chart that has like literally like 1,000 projects inside of this thing, right? Those computing, those foundations like the CNCF, I think provide companies a very smooth and well-managed mechanism to, again, birth open source and then kind of move it off so that they can effectively remove any conflict of interest that the community base might for actually kind of read into by the company actually overly influencing the community and trying to manipulate it. And it will also, I think, give like the commercial market itself a little bit more confidence in like the true democratic nature of the governing body that actually sits over the open source itself. So that bifurcation of getting kind of the open source community itself a little bit out of the hands of your company is really important because it reduces that conflict of interest. I will tell you though that as like a steward of a community, one of the things that you can still do actually to kind of manage the community without the actual ownership is to stay very actively involved, obviously at the committee level of the open source element. You can certainly have a vote and a say in terms of the discussions and the areas of focus that the committee that governs your project really kind of stay kind of in line with. And while it's not a guarantee, it's a democracy, not a dictatorship. I think there's a lot of things you can do as a community steward and obviously your general understanding of the open source project itself, because you created it, that can kind of keep, again, the community itself oriented in pretty much the high level areas that you think are really important, right? As long as you don't deviate too much from the fray. The other thing I will tell you too is that in order to manage community without ownership effectively, you have to have an absolutely like steadfast commitment from both a resource and a money standpoint, an investment standpoint, to make sure that you continue to drive as a company a very like noticeable level of contribution to the existing source code that you actually released into the project, right? Like nobody wants to actually like get a bunch of source code and get involved in the community and then look at the people that birthed it and be like, well, like all of the Git pushes are coming from like the community and like nothing is coming from the steward company that essentially like launched this thing in the first place, right? Like nothing can drop confidence faster than you not sort of eating your own dog food and making sure that you're showing the community that you're willing to continue to invest, again, both time and money on an ongoing basis in perpetuity, right? To make that project better and better and better, right? So that's the one thing I will tell you too is like, I think I've seen a lot of cases where companies have started open source and said, cool, we've checked the box, like this is all great. And then what they kind of miss the boat on is when you look at kind of the pro forma developments and the cost spend structures moving forward through their 5-year plans, they dramatically underestimate the amount of ongoing investment that actually has to be put into the development and delivery of additional source code into what was already given to make sure the community kind of still has the energy and the push we talked about before.
Yeah, that's an interesting one there as well. I mean, I would say that, you know, there's this, I wouldn't call it common misconception, but it's kind of like this thing that is in everybody's head that, well, open source means that other people write the code for me, right? And so that's, you know, absolutely not the case. And in fact, when we look at a lot of companies out there that are doing open source, there's not just the open source community there's your team that is managing that community, which is a blend of relationship management and coding and thought leadership, right? You have to have those core people who can help drive the community. And then you have to have your whole other team that is helping drive code into that product. And then you have, you know, additional teams helping build, you know, kind of monetization structures on top of that, maybe additional enterprise functionality, security, things like that, as a wrapper around the open source project, right? And so as a model, open source in itself, when you choose this to get leverage from the community, the value is, it feels like the value is more, you know, driven around leverage from the community and, you know, kind of funnel generation, opportunity generation, and other things than it is saving money on R&D, right? It's definitely
that's right
there.
I think a really good way to, Ryan, just real quick, a really good way to kind of illustrate that is generally what I've seen, and again, I'm not a developer, but I've played one on TV, right? Like the core branch contributions inside of an open source community generally originate from either the committee or like power users or power influencers inside of the community, right? So those core branch extensions that start everything off in that community as it progresses over time, start at that level. And then the contribution basis is really from the community is really around collaboration around creating additional branches off of those main branches, right? That actually start to refine and fundamentally deliver a real function that the intention of the core branch started, right? So without people popping off kind of the trunks of these initial branches, right? There actually is no kind of community because it's very hard just to say, hey, throw a community and get, you know, get 1 million people to decide what the core branch should be. Like you have to invest to create the core branches, and then the community can kind of iterate and experiment with all sorts of kind of breakoffs from that.
Awesome. Well, so going back to the, you know, kind of the capitalism portion of this, the monetization side, you know, we've talked a little bit about Red Hat, we've talked about Docker, we've talked a little bit about different patterns we see there. You know, what are the different monetization style patterns you're seeing inside of companies? How do they take this and actually make money from it?
Yes, it's a $1 million question. There's also 1 million answers to this, and so I will for the sake of this discussion, I will focus on what are the actual Annie patterns, right? So how not to make money more than actually like how to make money, because the question of how to make money is pretty diverse. I can touch on a few things, but I think I want to talk about the Annie patterns to this too, like what doesn't make a successful monetization effort. So I think a few things are important. There's four ground rules that I've learned, right, that are really important. We've talked about a few already, but I'll start with one. So the first rule is like, look, do not open source anything until you really understand the monetization path, right? This sort of ties into kind of a really important element, which is, you actually need to understand like what is the real strategic control point and value that your company is delivering to market through your technology. And I think it's very, very common, right, that a lot of early stage companies, and I'm talking like through A, B, even kind of sometimes C round companies, they don't really understand like what really is their strategic control point until it's too late. And very often you see it like their open source actually just like sort of gobble up that strategic control point, and then they've lost it, right? They've lost the leverage. So I'll give you a great example for us at Docker, and I'm assuming at some point somebody from Docker is going to see this and say this is totally wrong, but this is my point of view. I viewed kind of the runtime element of Docker, right? The container engine itself was obviously a massive step forward in the market to simplify the use of containers inside of cloud native computing. And the impacts of that have been amazing over the past 5 years. One of the things I will tell you though is that I don't know if we necessarily had our arms really around kind of the long-term monetization path before we kept, releasing that open source and kept building upon it. And one of the things that we realized like pretty late in the game where we made a mistake was we delivered an open source product that actually solved like this incredible strategic issue inside of a marketplace globally. And then we did a couple things that we shouldn't have, right? We kept adding features to it that actually were like features that people would pay for. And then we kept adding features into it that actually made it more stable and more secure, right? So like the additional value elements of like the user experience, like the security elements and the stability elements, like typically are like mainstays of like how you actually want to take open source and then move it into commercial models that corporate entities say like, yes, I need all of those things, right? Like I don't have a bunch of hackers. I just need you to make the experience better, easier, secure, and stable for me. So, don't open source anything until you really understand your monetization path and your customer base. I would also say you don't need to open source an entire product or an entire strategic control point. I'll continue on the Docker experience, right? When you kind of break down like the elements that were actually inside of the open source project of Docker and are still there today, we probably could have stopped like literally at just the runtime and not put in all these other elements onto it, right? And so when we look at open source, I would just highly recommend that from a monetization perspective, you can really get very finite in terms of like the exact specific elements within your portfolio that you actually open source that can deliver value, but don't actually give away like your product or your strategic control point, right? So I've seen examples where like in the database world, like people are actually not open sourcing their database anymore. They're actually open sourcing like a very unique schema that actually drives the database. And that's cool, you know what I mean? But like the technology beyond the schema, like that actually kind of still stays within a wall because it is a strategic control point for those companies. The other thing I will tell you, and we talked about this, is look, I'm sure there's aberrations that still work in this model. I would highly recommend that, again, if you're going to do this, do not steward the open source community inside of your commercial entity. It creates conflicts. And the bigger your community gets, the more the conflicts get created and the more people think you're trying to manipulate them if you actually are a commercial interest leading and managing this thing throughout, right? It'll break down. The last thing, and super important, maybe the most important, I should have started with this. If you're going to monetize open source, you have to make sure that your open source is enabled with telemetry so that you know who, when, and how it's being used. Like, I cannot tell you like the mistakes that I see made at a lot of different companies, including everything that I've worked in for the past 15 years, where I get a chart basically at the end of every week that says like, hey, 350,000 new users downloaded our open source. And everybody's going, yeah, this is great. And then as a capitalist, I go, okay, who is it? When are they using it? And how are they using it? And it's like a bunch of blank stares in front of me. And like, why would we care about that, right? Like, the reality is this: like, if you can't answer who, when, and how the open source is being used, then as a capitalist or as a monetization element, you will not be able to actually figure out like how to create the right monetization strategy to take advantage of it. And I would tell you that, in my view, again, as a capitalist, the telemetry activation inside of open source is the price that users pay for free. Right. And I know some communities backlash against that, right? And we all have like these horrible experiences of Oracle and all these auditing elements of kind of what I'll call Gen 1, like tech behemoths, right? But the reality is you can structure the conversation around instituting telemetry inside of your open source, and the community can accept it if the narrative is structured the right way. But in my view, like I said, it is the price users pay for free, and it's critical. It's critical for us as commercial entities to be able to have it so we can actually make strategic decisions and how we position the upstream from that to actually build our companies from.
Awesome. No, and I think that definitely when we think about, the different patterns there, right? We see a lot of interesting items there around monetization and getting leverage out of the overall platform itself. It's interesting to see as well that the getting the telemetry from the product, understanding who's using the product, how we're using the product, right? This all goes back to the basic life cycle of a software company as well, right? As we're a startup, we may not be an open source startup, right? We may just be a typical SaaS product with a pricing and packaging page, that everyone goes to. We still need to start off with a good perspective on what is the value of our product. How do we understand how to present it to the customers and how do they use it, right? It's the same research you have to do, whether or not you lay out an open source model or you're just a typical SaaS product, right? And so when we see our companies progress from that early startup to kind of more advanced startup to a scale up, right? That maturity level is something that we focus a lot on inside of our portfolio companies. How do you mature from being a simple, you think about it, you look at the pricing pages of most SaaS products, most of that comes from someone in day two going, I think we'll charge this much for this much for this, and this much for this, right?
Yeah,
and a lot of our,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And when we look at a lot of our open source products, it's like, we developed this product and we made it open source. Well, that's what we'll do. We'll go build the business model. Well, no, we need to actually think about whether or not the company itself is viable and that the business model is well supported and gets leverage from the base open source. If it doesn't, then it's better as a community than it is as a company, right? And so you have to think about whether or not that gives you leverage, gives you the ability to build a successful company on top of. And I think that we see a lot of people get into the later stages of a startup into the scale up stage and realize, oh, wow, we really need to provide way more value than what we were just providing with that open source product, right? And so that's it's a great word of warning there at the beginning.
Yeah, and Ryan, I actually want to add to that, but I also want to make sure we come back and we touch on sort of the shift in sort of the open source licensing models that we're starting to see kind of develop here too. We can come back to that. But in terms of like your point around kind of the leverage and like, how do you kind of create leverage inside of your business model with open source? Look, I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb to sit and say, look, like our investment inside of an open source construct year in, year out needs to kind of deliver somewhere between let's call it a 6x to 10x return on the investment for us, right? Now, look, that investment doesn't need to be hard-coded to people like me, which is I'll always focus on revenue, right? Because that's just how I'm geared, right? There's things like intangibles, like brand awareness, contribution to the general progression of the democratization of technology and our society and all these things, right, that go into that 10x return on investment. So I don't want to make it hard-coded ROI. It can include soft intangibles as well for the company. The thing that I think is really important, and this is a good way to look at how to create leverage, the models of using open source to progress a product, if you look at it in that kind of one-dimensional view, I would argue with you that most open source models sort of languish because it's about the progression of like a tactical product itself. If you can kind of expand it and say, look, my product is actually like part of the progression and the opening up of actually like a new marketplace or an ecosystem, right, that really has massive impact inside of a market, inside of markets. It's a better way to look at kind of how you actually orient your open source, right? So if I give open source to a community with the idea that I want to improve a product, that's one dimensional and you'll get one return. But if I give open source and structure it to a community with the understanding that a marketplace can develop around that open source, that's a better ecosystem of integrations that can lead to not just your company, but thousands of companies being able to have a better ground position to actually enter into things like joint ventures or do embedded licensing agreements with on a commercial level, right? That's an accelerator that moves beyond just, you know what I mean? Like this is for a product. And you start to get more and more buy-in, not only from independent people that are involved with the community, but also the interest now at the commercial level for other companies that have cost centers associated with participation in highly functional and highly collaborative communities that make their products better or make their go-to-markets better as well.
Awesome.
I'm gonna jump in because we got a question related to this general topic in the chat that I wanted to call your attention to about from Vijit about monetization. The question was, we see startups with open core and SaaS monetization models, but over time I've seen more folks leave the open core in favor of SaaS. Is this a pattern others see as well? For example, Elastic went from open core to prioritizing.
Yeah, I think it just gets back to what I just said, right? Which is people are realizing like, look, I need to use open source as a marketplace and ecosystem development engine and not as a product advancement engine, right? And that's just the reality. Like these things are intensive. They cost a lot of money. They're high maintenance. So the reality is like, the real returns when you start looking at 10x, 20x, 30x impacts like on the commercialization or the monetization elements of the company that stewards the project, it goes back to like, look, do you want to make a database better? Or do you actually want to be like Salesforce and create like a massive ecosystem around that database? That's awesome, right? Where there's a new extension and a new kind of acceleration of a flow of commerce within the general market. And the reality is like marketplace development is really the place you need to go to in order to see those returns, generally speaking.
Well, that tapers well into my next question as well, which is, when we think about the evolution of this, right? Mongo comes to mind, right? And that is, the SSPL licensing and the server-side public licensing structure is definitely something that both they've driven forward, but also is a reaction to how people were using their products in industry. So it would be good to get your opinion on SSPL and these new structures.
Yeah. So let me tell you about the most exciting and the most horrifying day of your life when you have a successful open source community that starts to take off. It's the same day, all in the same. It's like within 30 seconds of each other. Large-scale incumbent technology companies show up at your door and say, this is awesome. We want to participate and actively, invest and contribute to your code branches. As part of that, we'd like to actually be part of the committee elements as well that kind of help shape directionally where the open source is going. And as a community steward, you go, oh my God, this is going to be amazing, right? Like just the distribution, the awareness, everything, crazy. It's going to be amazing. And then you start to realize like, man, like these companies have massive marketplaces that are already designed to extensively monetize shit better than you could ever possibly do, right? I mean, you can get there, but they have such a head start and they have such an inordinate amount of free cash flow to be able to do it that you start to realize like, oh, like I just sort of let in like potentially my own worst enemy. So look, I have extensive experience in what happens when like Google, Microsoft, and Amazon want to get up into your business plan through your open source. Like, it's really cool to watch your community just absolutely explode. Your commercial entity sits there and says, whoa, 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 like time out. What's going on here, right? So what I would tell you is, and the MongoDB is a great example. I think I've seen an uptick in this. I absolutely agree with what they did and some of the new elements here. But some of the, what I'll call initial Apache-based, licensing constructs that were kind of out there in the market were very loose in terms of the usage rights and characteristics that were described inside of the governing rules of those contracts. I will tell you that inside of, and it's moving now, but it's moving into more kind of OCI compliant runtimes, but inside of the base constructs of things like AKS, EKS, GKE, inside of all the big clouds, like their initial constructs all used tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of instances of Docker runtimes for free, right? And so what you saw was a cloud vendor basically looking at a company that had, several $billion in valuation that had gone through several rounds, and they were kind of looking at it and saying, I could go and spend $4 or $5 billion for you, or I could actually just take this incredibly like stable, secure kind of runtime open source, which is sort of what I need anyways. And I can layer in everything on top of it to develop a cloud service, right? Which I will just extensively sell to my customer base directly without you, right? So, the idea that we don't want to sort of bastardize or impede the actual like intention of free usage for like individuals and non-commercial entities to use the software in new and creative ways for free. We don't want to break that bond because it would dissolve the underpinning of the entire open source ideology to begin with. But some of these new licensing constructs, like the server-side public license, it's called SSPL. There's a few other variants that are out there now, have explicitly actually said, look, like everything inside the community element ideologically that we've always subscribed to is fair game. People can take the software, do what they want with it, contribute it, build new ideas off of it. That's all great. But when you start to see like large scale companies come in and actually develop targeted kind of offerings that are commercialized offerings that have huge impact to their top line growth, there's now language inside of some of these new models, these new licensing constructs that actually limit that and say, look, right, if that's going to happen, this is not allowed to be used in that mass kind of construct of adoption. And if it does go that path, there has to be a natural progression where those users kind of have a natural path to get actually instantiated into the commercial model itself, so that there can be an equitable sharing of value, right? When that happens. And look, in MongoDB's place, like it caused kind of a riff, right? Because they stood up to Amazon, which I give them a lot of credit for, and they put in this new SSPL license. But what did Amazon do? It gets back to my point. When you've got almost $100 billion in cash, it's probably more now on the sideline, just said, you know what, we'll just build our own MongoDB from scratch. Like, that's what Amazon said, right? But at the end of the day, there was a ton of people in the market beyond Amazon that were doing the same thing. They actually said, no, this is fair, right? So MongoDB actually still has a very vibrant and strong community, but they were able to actually retrofit some of their more abusive, I would say, cloud providers and commercial participants that were taking advantage of their open source into a model that actually contributes now to their revenue growth, which is fantastic. So yeah. I would strongly urge you all to make the right choices early on with your licensing constructs, which is probably going to be in this SSPL range. And don't just go with the old school like Apache 2.0 stuff, because if it really takes off, people will build around it and they will leave you behind. They will cut out the middleman.
Yeah, there's got to be some protection for the people who are producing the products.
For sure.
Especially when you look at the major cloud providers, which can just basically turn it into a cloud service and sell it, right? And that's kind of contrary to the mission of open source overall. And so, yeah, I'm a fan of the SSPL license. I know it's created some controversy. It's created some confusion as well, right? We see people who are building cloud products that are are not databases confused as to whether or not they could still use Mongo. You know, they definitely can, right? They can definitely use those products inside of their product. They just can't reproduce the service and sell it to someone else, right? You can't just cloudify Mongo and sell it again, right?
That's right.
So SSPL is a good evolution in the market right now.
Well, and Vijay brought up in the chat that larger tech incumbents kind of come in multiple flavors. You know, there might be some that are more friendly and supportive, and some that are a little bit more combative, a la Amazon.
Absolutely, and I don't want to put Amazon in a bad place. Like I think there's situations where they can be friendly and they can be, utilize their leverage, and I think they're all sort of like that. You know, like Google was sort of a problematic relationship for Docker, right? And then generally, like they're probably viewed as like one of the best in terms of like their community and kind of their position to open source. But you know, when you start like hitting like key things that like sort of disrupt baseline either operational constructs that drive like bottom line kind of costs for these companies, or have impact in like creating new markets that can drive top line growth. Like make no mistake, like they're all $1 trillion companies for a reason, right? Like they use their position fundamentally to their advantage when they need to, but they're also cool when they know that like, it's okay to kind of let this run a little bit more. But Docker was just a very unique situation for us because it was such a dramatic shift in the underpinning of like how actual units of compute were going to be defined within kind of infrastructures away from kind of VMs, right? That situation just became like, this is a paradigm shift in computing. So we're not going to give up ownership of that, right? Like they brought in all the guns, right? All of them did, right? And we may have been a little bit vain and egotistical to think we had more leverage than we thought, right? At Docker. So pick your 7 deadly sins. That was our issue at Docker, I think. Is there any other questions?
Yeah, I was gonna say, why don't we open it up to folks on the line if you want to either come off mute or drop your questions into chat. More than happy to jump in.
So if I follow your discussion, I will end up, so to say, maybe start not directly with open source, but first of all, start a product and then think about what makes sense to open source in terms of leveraging the market, because this is the way you attract, to say, the tech people from the market. Nevertheless, the tech people might not be, as to say, the decision makers at the end for your product. Right?
Yeah, I think so. I think another way to look at it too is, I certainly don't want to say, open source is a commodity, but like one of the interesting ways to look at this is, I was going through this with a company that I actually invested in, that's a new startup, and they were, they had a base platform, a base SaaS platform, and it did a specific function, and they were also thinking about open source. And one of my comments to them was like, look, like, what is the thing that you've done here at the most rudimentary level that's going to get commoditized the fastest if it like actually like takes off in the market? And so what I mean by that is like, look, there's baseline elements of any platform or any technology that there's a low barrier of entry. You may create a better mousetrap initially, but the reality is like the market will kind of move forward and you can't completely protect yourself from an intellectual property perspective. My viewpoint would be like, figure out like what gets commoditized fastest inside of your business model at a technology level. That's actually generally like really good target areas where you're like, look, we actually want to invest and actually make sure this commoditized layer of service or function continues to get innovated on, but really like the higher level value propositions that we as like a company want to deliver and sell out into the market, like that's where we really want to keep our core focus, right? And to kind of, I'll go back again, I know I'm plugging this Docker thing, but it's just a great example. In Docker's case, like the most commoditized thing that you could say is like, okay, here's a container runtime, right? Like just here, like give it out to people. That at least lets people start to experience what it's involved, makes it easy for them to start to containerize applications and run them. That was a commodity. Just like I would argue now, like Kubernetes is also a commodity, right? It's an orchestration framework for cluster management and containers, right? The reality is like, it's a commodity, it's kind of given out to the world, and sort of the value that builds on top of it is really where companies sort of come from. It's not about providing Kubernetes because it's just there, right? So yeah, so I think that's it, right? I also would just highly recommend too, like experimenting with freemium models initially also will give you kind of data around like, what do your customers really like? And what's like really impactful inside of the product, right? That maybe is things that you want to keep and kind of develop on a proprietary basis or a more protected basis inside of your company. And what are the things that just sort of, you know, are good value, but you know, over the long term, like aren't really like the massive like value elements that your customers see inside the product. And maybe those are the areas that you actually want to say, once this freemium model is established, you know, we've got our own internal development strategies for deriving more top line value for our customers that we'll sell in the marketplace. And some of these other areas that would benefit from obviously progression and innovation that don't maybe carry the top tagline value statements of our company's focus can go to the open source community, and they can actually go use them and think of new ways to construct them and employ them, and hopefully you gain some benefit from that as well.
There's definitely an element of building your go-to-market motion at the beginning and playing that chess game 10 moves ahead before thinking about the technology decision, right? It's how do we play out the go-to-market motion over time to know that we're going to derive commercial value out of this. Otherwise, you're building a community, not a company, right? And so how do we play that go-to-market motion ahead? And there's definitely a ton of that discussion that needs to happen. And we typically find, you know, early stage or later stage startups who didn't have that conversation at the beginning and are now trying to build a business model out of something that they don't, you know, that is a community, not a company.
Yeah, think of Pandora's box, right? Once you sort of open that without a plan, that can be a problem.
Other questions?
I had a quick question. This is Vijit. I'm product manager here at Corelight, and we are a cybersecurity company, focusing on bringing a security-focused open source tool to the market. And one of the challenges we have is open source projects in general. A lot of them cater to large communities of developers, whereas when you think about security, it's a smaller community of sort of analysts and so on. So one of the struggles we've had is, we found a pretty good product market fit amongst a small community of really fanatical analysts, but just scaling the reach of the open source community beyond a certain point seems like we've kind of hit plateau. So I was wondering if you guys have seen something similar.
Yeah, thanks, Vijit. And by the way, I love your background. That's pretty cool.
+1.
Yeah. So, you know, security is really interesting inside of open source. And the reason I say that is, you know, most of the, you know, for dumb people like me, it's been, okay, like one of the clear lines of kind of differentiation between an open source product and a commercial product was security, right? Like actually enabling security in the open source was actually like one of the defining factors of actually letting you sell a commercial product around it. So it's always kind of interesting when you look at security open source, it's like, well, that tactic is gone to a certain extent because you're actually open sourcing the security. So where is kind of that gate that kind of moves you from, hey, here's a security oriented open source element, now here's a security oriented product. I would tell you, like, and as you had mentioned, obviously that more of a niche sort of market in general in terms of like its TAM or its size, right? So I would say, you know, one of the things in technology that has not changed from, you know, sweaty Steve Ballmer, like jumping up on stage in like the early 90s at a Microsoft conference about the developers, it's finding paths downstream to developers, like in general, right? So even though your security, you know, kind of open source project is oriented around a very niche audience inside of the security analyst framework itself, you know, what I would recommend is really kind of looking for opportunities to kind of push either features, ease of use, optics, command and control closer within that community, actually to the edge with the developer, and kind of create a way to actually bridge the conversation between security and developer and make that more efficient. Because I can tell you unequivocally that like out of all the different relationships that exist inside of the world of software development, I think developer to operations has gotten better, right? But developer to security is still broken, right? Because security, typically the perception has been, you're slowing me down. Just let me build and like whatever, we'll handle this stuff later. Whereas, you know, and I know that if you don't have a well-defined security structure and process and tool set instantiated into the development itself, there's a lot of rework that has to be done and a lot of brittleness that develops inside of the application itself over time that can be very costly. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of my view on it, which is like try to find a path for the community to do work that actually makes what the open source element that you're doing more accessible to developers, and just try to reduce the friction and build a relationship between the developer build cycle and the day two operational management construct of the security that needs to be imposed on it. I'm
Awesome.
sorry, and that could be totally wrong too, buddy. That's just my personal view, right?
No, that's something
Thanks,
we've been
Tim.
focusing on as well, is branching away, not just focusing on the security professionals, but sort of trying to tap into the data analysts and the data scientists that can take advantage of some of that data. So.
Yeah. Those are developers in my view, right? It's people that are close to algorithmic development, processing models, and actual code development. Yeah.
Well, I know we've reached the end of our time box. I think we could probably keep jamming on this, but I want to let everybody go to their next Zoom meeting. But thank you guys so much. I hope everyone got as much value out of this conversation as I did. If you want to share it, we'll be posting, I think, Christina, you'll post a recording of it. So if you have some colleagues, some wink, wink, nudge, nudge developers who need to hear the security message, Vijit, you can send it along to them. And thank you guys all so much for this great conversation.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you,
Thanks,
Rachel.
everybody.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks, Christina.